Yesterday, President Cyril Ramaphosa signed the Land Expropriation Bill into law. And like this headline says, it was a very contentious move that, based on the initial responses of the major opposition parties, has already caused a lot of controversy. What's interesting to me is the EFF vehemently opposing this law, because back in 2018, they were the first party to bring a motion forward in Parliament requesting that the constitution be changed to allow for land expropriation without compensation in South Africa. So what has happened since then, and why are they so opposed to the move that the president made yesterday? Since 1994, over the last 31 years, South Africa's land reform and land restitution process has moved incredibly slowly, consistently missing its targets. Initially, government set out to have transferred 30% of land back to Black South Africans by 1999. Then the target was moved back to 2010, then 2015. And by 2018, official reports said that only about 8 to 10% of land had in fact been transferred back to the Black majority. When the land reform and restitution process started in 1994, reports estimated that white South Africans, who were about 5% of the population, held about 86% of the land, and Black South Africans, who were over 80% of the population, held or owned about 14% of the land. And so the process to rectify that has gone incredibly slowly. In the other land stories that I've covered on my page, I've pointed to the fact that one of the reasons that has been identified for the slow progress in land reform is the fact that the South African government is working in accordance with a policy called willing buyer, willing seller. This willing buyer, willing seller principle is also known as market-led land reform, and it gives existing landowners the right to be compensated at market rates for their land. And the way that willing buyer, willing seller, or market-led land reform in South Africa works is that when land claimants put in a claim, government then approaches the existing landowners as the buyer on behalf of those claimants. The existing landowners have a right to negotiate for their land to be bought at market rates. They also have a right to veto the sale of their land if they're not happy with the offer that government gives. And once government buys that land back, they then redistribute it to the claimants. You guys will remember that last year we spoke about the Mala Mala case, which was the biggest payout to a single landowner in South African history, 1.1 billion rand, and that basically bankrupted the department's budget for buying rural land that year, settling just one land claim. The negotiation process, the fact that owners have veto power, the large amounts that land is being sold for has really slowed down and held back efficient land reform in South Africa for the last 31 years. So in 2018, the EFF brought forward a motion in Parliament for the Constitution to be updated to allow for land expropriation without compensation. Any party that wants to change any aspect of the Constitution needs a 2/3 majority in Parliament, so they offered to vote with the ANC in order to achieve that 2/3 majority. The section of the Constitution that was under review was Section 25. Back in 2018, when the EFF brought the motion forward in Parliament, they were very clear that they wanted the Constitution amended to explicitly outline expropriation without compensation as a means of achieving land reform. 3 years later, when the ANC presented the draft expropriation bill to Parliament, the EFF withdrew their support from the ANC because the bill did not specifically dictate that expropriation without compensation should be pursued as one of the best means for achieving land reform. Instead, the bill said that the state has a right to expropriate land, and that in certain circumstances where appropriate, a court can rule that compensation will be nil. I think what's also really important to note is that even without EFF amendments, even without this expropriation law that Ramaphosa just signed, the South African Constitution has always allowed for land expropriation without compensation. If you have a look at Section 25 of the Constitution, which deals with land and property, you can see that. If you look at points 2 and 3, it says property may be expropriated only in terms of law of general application, A, for a public purpose or in the public interest, and B, subject to compensation, the amount of which and the time and manner of payment of which have either been agreed to by those affected or decided or approved by a court. The amount of the compensation and the time and manner of payment must be just and equitable, reflecting an equitable balance between the public interest and the interests of those affected, having regard to all relevant circumstances. One of those circumstances is the market value of the property, but another circumstance is also the purpose of the expropriation. So the way Section 25 is worded, specifically those words just and equitable, it doesn't really come down on either side. It doesn't say that market value must be paid for the property, and it also doesn't say that the property must be expropriated without compensation. It actually allows for both, especially if you pay attention to the part where it says a court can dictate how much compensation should be paid for a property. It also says in point 4 that the public interest includes the nation's commitment to land reform and to reforms to bring about equitable access to all South Africa's natural resources. So the expropriation bill that was signed into law this week, to me, looks like it's just a reiteration of what the Constitution already says, which is that compensation should be decided by a number of factors, including what is just, what is fair, and what is in the interest of land reform. It's just that this law now says that in certain cases, a court may rule that compensation is null. If the state has already shown a lack of political will to use the Constitution to pursue land expropriation without compensation, the question then becomes, why will they have the political will to interpret this new law in that way? They don't have to. And that's why the EFF is unhappy. They feel like this new law is toothless and it doesn't go far enough and it won't change enough in terms of how the land reform process in South Africa is going. What do you guys think?